This is talking foreign policy, an internationalist perspective on Canada's role abroad. And today we will be discussing opposition to Canada's role in enabling Israel's genocidal siege and violence in Gaza. Over the past 6 weeks, Israel's killed more than 15,000 Palestinians, and the Canadian government has supported Israel in so many different ways in backing those genocidal policies. But amidst the horrors and Canada's backing, there have been huge mobilizations. There have been mass protests, many disruptions, direct actions. The most widely endorsed parliamentary petition calling for a ceasefire. In response to this uprising, we have seen a little bit of rhetorical shift from the Prime Minister, backing away from his strongest diplomatic support for Israel. To discuss these unprecedented mobilizations, we have Palestinian Youth Movement organizer Laura Khoury. First of all, thanks for coming on. And can you talk a little bit about this huge mobilization that took place in Ottawa, probably the biggest Palestine solidarity demonstration in Ottawa's history, and maybe the biggest anti-war mobilization? Can you tell us a little bit about what the mobilization, but also a bit what went into organizing that protest?
For sure. First of all, thank you so much for having me. What we've seen on Ottawa on Saturday was actually unprecedented. It was a historic march that we've never seen before in the history of Palestinian organizing, and some people have even said that it was unprecedented in terms of a mass movement coming to Ottawa in these big numbers. I mean, we had buses coming from all over Ontario and Quebec in big numbers, other than people driving and coming in. And this just comes to show that although there have been weekly protests in all of the major cities in Canada, the government has refused to listen to our demands. We've seen tens of thousands of people show up in Montreal, in Toronto, in Ottawa, and there's still a refusal. So the movement that has been consistently organizing itself has felt like it needed to escalate and really show in front of Parliament that there's a huge number of people in Canada that do not stand with the government's position on this genocide, and not only their position, but are seeing the lies and the hypocrisies that are being fed by this government to the people around the discourse of human rights, around the discourse of wanting to have democracies, when they are supporting an Israeli genocide against the Palestinian people that is not only happening in Gaza, but there's collective punishment happening in the prisons, that's happening in the West Bank, where people are being killed, refugee camps are being bombed in the West Bank. So this mobilization just shows the will of the people in Canada to fight for what's right and to really show what's been true. And this movement hasn't been just mobilizations, but it has been grown in its organizing. There's been multiple groups who have been organizing civil disobedience because of the refusal of the government to listen to the people.
Yeah, well, that was one of the things I have to say. When I first heard that there was going to be the march on Ottawa, I was kind of a little skeptical of whether it would be a success, because there have been these massive demonstrations here in Montreal every weekend, and same thing in Toronto and other cities. And I was like, well, it's going to be difficult to get large number of people out in Ottawa and onto buses to go to Ottawa. But clearly, this was a success beyond maybe some people imagined it or hoped for it, but success far beyond what I expected. And people talking about 100,000 people. And if you look at the images from Parliament Hill, which is like full, and that's a huge area, and then you look at some of the overviews from other parts of the city, and I've seen some time lapse of the demonstration. It clearly was just an absolutely massive demonstration in a city, let's be clear, that is not known for massive demonstrations. But yeah, so also this was maybe somewhat of a culmination of all this different organizing. But can you also talk a little bit about, you mentioned it a bit, but there's been these biggest ever pro-Palestinian demonstrations in Montreal, biggest ever pro-Palestinian demonstrations in Toronto. And then also, and those are usually been on the weekends, but then also like sort of throughout the week, all these, direct actions, bridges, trains, party fundraisers, et cetera, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about also so the 6 weeks of mobilization in other cities, in Montreal and other cities?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the government officials and even people on the streets had thought that this would dwindle really quickly, but what we've actually seen is that the people have gotten more angry, that they are that some people came with only the demand for a ceasefire, but those demands are widening. We're seeing people calling for the end of the occupation, for the end of the siege on Gaza, because as we all know, that this didn't start on October 7th. And a lot of the people are realizing that the lies that the media are trying to feed us are not true. And the more that we mobilize and show the truth, the more there's been repression and suppression of the truth, whether it's on campuses, whether it's by the politicians themselves or by the media. For example, CTV News just released a policy for their journalists to not use the word ceasefire and not use the word Palestine. And that suppression is because they are seeing that the movement is only growing and it's not dwindling down. Even after we saw a humanitarian pause, there was the largest march in Ottawa. And so people have even gone to civil disobedience because they have not been heard. That people have been showing up to MP offices, doing sit-ins at MP offices, blocking bridges. And these are tactics that are used in order to bring attention to the movement at large, and to show the politicians that business should not go as usual when thousands of Palestinians are being genocided who are civilians, where civilian infrastructure, including hospital, mosques, churches, residential buildings, are being bombed, and our government refuses to even call for a ceasefire, which is the minimum demand that we have. Because even if this war ends, and even before this war, Gaza has been under an illegal siege for over 17 years, land, air, and sea blockade, where nothing is allowed to enter Gaza. And it's going to be even more horrific after the war, where building materials are not allowed in. Now with the pause, there are aid trucks coming in, but that's not nearly enough for the 2.3 million people who are living in the Gaza Strip. And so this really shows that people are not just there to mobilize and showing up to protest, but they're taking initiative to escalate, because they don't accept that this continues in their name or or the elected officials speaking on their behalf.
Yeah, the other element of, with all this sort of demonization in the media and the repression, and still that the protests are getting bigger and more bold and more disruptive is quite amazing. And so at the center of a lot, I mean, obviously many groups across the country, that are local groups in different cities and all kinds of longstanding groups, Canadians for Justice, Peace in the Middle East, Just Peace Advocates, Independent Jewish Voices, all kinds of, National Council Came Muslim, many different groups that are involved in these mobilizations. But one of the groups has been at the center, which is you're of course organizing with, the Palestinian Youth Movement, has been right at the center of these mobilizations. I know specifically here in Montreal. I think in Toronto as well, and in Ottawa, I believe, for the March on Ottawa. I'm not sure it's exactly the same in every city, but can you just tell us a little bit about the Palestinian Youth Movement, a bit about its sort of views, a bit of its organizing tactics, organizational structure, whatever?
For sure. So the Palestinian Youth Movement is mainly made up of Arab and Palestinian youth. We believe in the role of the youth in bringing about change and building mass movements. We are organized in about 14 cities between Europe and North America, where we have chapters set up, and they've been leading this fight for freedom, this fight for liberation in the diaspora for the last 10 years. And we've been building on this momentum. We've seen a huge uprising in 2021, where the movement really grew, and we've seen also a mass support for Palestine. It's definitely not the same as now, but it was one of the building blocks where the Palestinian Youth Movement was also able to build a lot, mainly with our communities, the Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim communities. And we believe that in order to really fight this fight, we need to be organized, and we need to have we have a vision around how we organize our youth in order to be able to absorb this kind of mass movement that is happening right now. And also part of our vision is building with other struggles of the global South, and those are a lot of the organizations that we organize with here. But in this moment, we've also seen a way broader coalition of organizations that are willing and coming for Palestine, even with the repression that they are facing. So the Palestinian Youth Movement essentially exists in those 14 cities. We've been at the lead of a lot of these mass mobilizations that are happening, but we also believe in the importance of educating people on the long history of the Palestinian struggle. Our views stand for the full liberation of Palestine, for the right of return of all of refugees, because a lot of us who are organizing in the Palestinian Youth Movement are actually descendants of refugees, of prisoners, etc. And we see that we have an active role to play in the struggle. Not only are we in solidarity with the Palestinian people, but a lot of us are the Palestinian people who have been directly affected by Zionist settler colonialism. And we also believe in the freedom of all of our prisoners, and we always center our prisoners as a central part of our struggle, because they have been leading the fight for freedom, and they have been imprisoned because they are calling for freedom. And so this is a short introduction about the Palestinian Youth Movement.
Well, people should certainly be putting the Palestinian Youth Movement on their radar. PYM should be, of course, very saluted for these amazing mobilizations and the organizing work. And anyone who's been involved in organizing knows, sometimes the mobilizations are really big and you think it just started yesterday, but in fact, there's lots of work that goes behind the scenes to doing these mass demonstrations and mobilizations. So thanks a lot, Laura, for coming on to Talking Foreign Policy. This was very inspirational amidst these horrible times. At least there is this great resistance, particularly the great work of Palestinian Youth Movement. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.